Grand Chute town supervisor will appear in court next month to face a felony charge connected to a Wisconsin Department of Justice investigation.
Ron Wolf is accused of getting a town contract for his landscaping business just after taking office in 2021. Jason Zimmerman has been reviewing court documents. He's live in Grand Chute with a first alert update. Jason.
Cammie, it's been more than a year since the DOJ launched its investigation, but tonight, for the very first time, we're learning specific allegations. If convicted, Wolf faces up to 3.5 years behind bars and a fine up to $10,000. On the Grand Chute Town Board, Ron Wolf has been at the center of controversy since taking office, first with allegations he wasn't a resident, and now a felony charge tied to a contract for Lakeshore Cleaners in the amount of more than $26,000 for a seeding project at Champion Pond. According to the criminal complaint, the amount was well in excess of the $15,000 limit set in state statutes. And while Wolf did abstain from voting on the contract, investigators say he told former town administrator Jim March he divested himself from the business, something March would later learn was not true. The complaint also alleges the town administrator said that Wolf told him he intended to bid on all town projects pertaining to his businesses. The administrator said he told Wolf he could not do that. Investigators go on to say Wolf claimed he signed the contract for Champion Pond before he was elected. However, Wolf was elected and sworn into office in April 2021. The bid was submitted in May and approved in June of that same year. 2 months ago, March was fired by the town board and since filed a federal lawsuit alleging his wrongful termination. March's attorney has suggested it was because he was a witness in the DOJ investigation. I spoke to Wolf on the phone this afternoon about the felony charge, and he says his attorney is in the process of drafting a response. Wolf is due in court on August 1st. Reporting live in Grand Chute, Jason Zimmerman, Action 2 News.